Hey, what's going on? I hope you guys are doing good. Today, I partnered up with AEJuice to bring you a cool tutorial. What we're gonna be doing is using their assets from the I Want It All bundle. It doesn't matter if it's AI video or regular video. I'm gonna be teaching you how to add that sazon, that spice to your video to bring it all together at the very end of your project. This is the video we're gonna be working on. All right, cool, let's get into it. There's times that you create AI videos and they look nice and pristine. There's always ways that you can make the footage look better. The way I usually approach it is I add a little bit of grain, some chromatic aberrations to make it look like it was shot on a film camera. Today, I'm gonna go over the process on how I usually do that. I created this cat image in Midjourney, and then I brought it into Kling AI to animate it, and I prompted a cat walking slowly, the camera pans right, and Kling did an amazing job at animating that cat. So I thought this video was really good starting point to start adding the final touches to make it feel more filmic. So first, we're gonna track this footage, right? The trick is to make that fog feel like it's living in this 3D scene. After we track the scene, I'm gonna scrub through the footage and find the flattest area. After I find the flattest area, I'm gonna create a solid and a camera. And I'm going to make sure that I scale it up so it fits in the general area where I want this fog layer to live. And then I'm gonna add a grid effect, rotate it, and try to mimic the perspective of that floor. When you're messing around with your solid layer, make sure that you use the X, Y, and Z control points to move it in 3D space, because as soon as you start moving this layer in all different types of ways, you're gonna mess that up. I'm scaling it up. So I'm just envisioning that this solid is the fog and making sure that if this solid layer moves in 3D space in the correct way, the fog should also do the same thing. And after that, I went to this fog layer and I turned it into a 3D layer. There you go, I'm parroting it to that solid layer. And what I'm gonna do is turn the fog on. So now we're gonna scale it up to make sure that it lives in that area. If you notice, there's some space on the right. We need to scale out this fog so that it takes up that space on the right. All right, we're gonna scale it on the X now, and we're gonna keep on scrubbing and moving it to make sure that we fill up that area on the right. There you go. Move that over to the right, make sure that it takes up that whole area. There you go, it's looking way better now. Once the fog looks like it's tracked on the scene and it feels good, now it's just about doing these little detailed edits. There you go, moving it up there so that it touches that horizon line. All right, so look, it's looking good now. It's doing what it needs to do. So here I'm gonna add a fill effect, and I'm gonna select that blue in the sky to make sure that fog feels like it's living in that world. I'm gonna add a levels effect. I'm gonna go down to the alpha channel and messing around with the levels effect to see what looks good. I just wanted a little bit more contrast. If you lower the whites, it's like lowering the opacity. There you go. And then you could also lower the opacity of the actual layer. So you could go back and forth between the levels effect and the opacity of the layer to strike the right balance. I think the fog is starting to live in the scene a little bit better. Now that we applied the fill effect, we applied some contrast to the alpha channel. You know, it's just about striking the right balance. Sometimes you need to feel it and not see it. All right, so now I'm gonna use the Rotobrush to roto the cat because I wanna make sure that this cat is walking over the fog. And with this roto layer, I'm also gonna create fog by the cat's feet. we make sure that we create different layers. And what this does is makes the scene look a little bit more realistic. So here you go. I'm freezing the Rotobrush. Usually what I do is a rough roto and then I just automatically go into freeze it. Now, if I see any mess ups in the Rotobrush, I'll go back and clean it up, because when I'm working on these shots, I'm in a flow state. If I have to go into the Rotobrush and I have to go to frame and frame, it's going to take away that flow from me. All right, so cool. So the Rotobrush did its thing, and now I'm just going to go back into the main comp and see if the Rotobrush did a good job. I'm going to duplicate the original Rotobrush layer. I'm going to rename it to Cat Overlay. Then I'm going to place that over the fog to see what it's doing. I'm also going to turn off the Rotobrush effect on the original layer. Now we have this sandwich effect where we have the Rotobrush cap over the fog layer. Now I'm making sure that those edges, they're soft enough so that it doesn't look weird in the composite. All right, so now continuing to mess around with the fill color so that it's not too bright. It feels like it's living in that scene. Fog is supposed to be subtle. So if it pokes out too much, it's gonna throw people off. I'm making sure that I'm picking the right amount of that blue to fit in this scene. Here you go, I'm just scrubbing like I usually do, scrub a billion times over. Another good thing is we can change this fog to any color. Here I'm testing how it looks as a red fog. The fog looks awesome as a red fog, but it's too much for this scene. But it's always good to test out different things. So here you go, I duplicated that fog and I named it Fog Over Cat's Legs. So now what I'm doing is using the Rotobrush layer of the cat as a matte in order for this fog to live at the bottom of the cat's legs. I created a mask and I'm gonna subtract the mask and I'm gonna add a slight feather for that fog to live at the bottom of his feet. I'm gonna place the fog over everything and feather out the edges of that fog layer. Now we get the fog living over the cat's legs. I have to animate that mask because as the cat moves along the screen, the mask stays stationary. So here you go, I'm creating a keyframe here. I'm creating a keyframe at the very end, rotating it slightly so that it lives right there by the cat's legs. Going to the middle, making sure that it still looks good in the middle. Now let's play this and let's see if it actually works. There you go, I think it did a good job. So I just lowered the opacity a little bit because I thought the fog was a little bit too much. All right, so now we're gonna create a whole bunch of expressions in order for that fog layer to mimic everything the main fog is doing. I'm gonna lock all the effects of the main fog layer. I'm gonna go through that first fill effect. I'm gonna alt click on the color and drag it to the fill color of the original fog layer. After Effects creates an expression that references the fill color of the original layer. So here you go. I'm gonna pick whip the opacity to the main layer. Now, whenever we change the opacity of the main layer, that other layer follows. After scrubbing through the timeline, I wanted to add some perspective to that fog layer. So I added a corner pin effect to create a 3D parallax shift. I'm manipulating the control points on the lower left and the lower right. We're gonna set keyframes to the beginning of the layer and at the very end. And we're gonna manipulate those points in order to get this fake 3D parallax shift. There you go. Just mess around with these points and scrub back and forth to see if we're actually getting this fake 3D shift. Make sure that they're equally spaced out so that we don't get any wonky 3D effect. And also, when we added this corner pin effect to the main layer, you start getting these empty pixels. So now we're gonna have to compensate for that by stretching out the layer on the X. Scrub through the timeline, making sure that we cover up those holes. Go to the end, making sure that there's no holes at the end. There's a little hole right there, stretch it out a little bit, go to the very end, and there you go, it looks good now. Once we got that main fog to look good with that 3D parallax, I'm gonna pick whip the scale of that fog over cat's legs layer to the main fog. Then we're gonna pick whip the position to the position of the main fog layer. So now when we scrub through the timeline, you see that the fog over the cat's legs are following the movement of the main fog layer. But there's still some shifting with the position that we still have to work on, because the 3D camera tracker is tracking something that AI created. So I created some keyframes at the beginning of the layer, and I'm gonna move it down a little bit. I'm gonna make sure that it matches with the keyframe at the very end. It's just gonna lower the opacity a little bit. Let's see how it looks now. I think it's looking good at this point. The fog is subtle enough. The next step is to start adding a LUT to it to get a certain color grade. So I found this cool LUT called Cold Blue that added good contrast and good color. It deepened those blues. The LUT came in and it looked really nice, but I also wanted to lessen the effect of the LUT. So I lowered the opacity of the LUT a little bit just to strike the right balance. I think this Cold Blue LUT is really nice. So the next step is to add some grain. So I'm gonna go to the film textures and I'm just gonna look for a grain that works with this shot. So I decided to go with Grain 04 with opacity at 50 because this light flicker in there that just adds a little bit to the scene. And then I find that soft light works better than overlay and multiply. So you have to make sure you find the right blend mode and then the right opacity level in order to make it feel like it's a part of the shot. So let's check it out at full screen. So once we apply this chromatic aberration effect, it comes in a little too strong. So we're gonna have to go into the effect controls to get it to work with our needs. So let's double click on this layer and find the controls. I bumped up the intensity to 85. I bumped up the offset to 1.50. And then I raised the softness to 170. And I think this gave us a nice subtle aberration effect. So we're gonna use this fog in two different ways. One to fade the title in, and then one to blur the title in. So let's go through that process now. What we're gonna do here is add a levels effect to the fog layer in order to animate the alpha channel going from 100% black to its original form. So after that, I'm gonna pick whip the fog map to the layer. Then I'm gonna turn on the luminance button in order to use the luminance of the fog to fade in the title. And then I'm gonna duplicate that levels effect so that we have two levels effect. So it goes from nothing to something, and then from something to all the way opaque. What I'm doing is I'm renaming the levels effect to levels 1 and levels 2. And on the second levels effect, I'm gonna go to the alpha channel and bring the whites all the way up. Once I get both of those levels effect to work and they're actually fading the text in, I'm gonna duplicate that fog matte layer. I'm gonna use it as a compound blur map. So here you go, I'm naming it compound blur map. I'm deleting the old levels effect from it. I'm gonna pre-compose it, name it compound blur map. I added the compound blur to the title. I'm going to the source and I'm clicking on effects and mask. What that does is whenever I'm animating the levels effect on the compound blur map, it understands that animation. Here you go, I'm just setting these keyframes. I'm gonna set the maximum blur to 0 at the second keyframe so that we start off with maximum blur, and when it animates down, it animates to no blur at all. I'm gonna set some keyframes here. One of the keyframes is gonna be set to its default settings, and another keyframe is gonna be set all the way to the whitest areas. Instead of it fading in as one whole piece, it fades in different areas. It gives it this interesting texture instead of having just a regular 0 to 100% transparency animation. I think that looks cool. You got this nice compound blur happening. You got the fade. Now let's go into the main comp and see what it does. I think that does what it needs to do. It's not in your face, but it adds a little bit more character than just fading the text in from 0 to 100. We can do that all day, every day. 0 to 100 real quick like Drake, but what I'm trying to do is add more character to the way the title animates in. So I'm gonna play it a couple of times, then we're gonna go into the final step. Kling AI, whenever it renders a video, it renders it at 30 frames per second. And the AEJuice fog asset was 25 frames per second. So in order for me to make all this live in a 24 frames per second world, what I'm doing is I'm adding an adjustment layer, and then I'm gonna apply the posterized time effect at 24 frames per second. It's gonna take all the animations underneath the adjustment layer and make sure that they all conformed to 24 frames per second. So that's a quick way of getting all your animations to play within a certain frame rate. And now I think it jives together a little bit more. The final step to tie everything in is to add some kind of audio track, right? I wanted to add a city soundscape to add to that eerie, dark, ominous feel of this clip. So I found this audio file called City Street 1 that I added to the composition. When I added it, it came in a little too bright. So I added a high pass filter, clicked on low pass, and bumped it down to 400. This muffled the sound. Now it feels like the sound effect is happening far in the distance, right? It adds to that gritty, ominous, dark tone of this scene. So what I'm gonna do is play this shot, and then play 3 other options with 3 other fog assets. AEJuice is having a Black Friday sale right now. I would suggest get the I Want It All bundle because there's just so many assets to choose from. Using these assets will get you to a final result very quickly. And that's the name of this game, right? When someone hires you, they want to make sure that you get the projects out in a timely fashion. If you're not ready to drop 150 bucks on these assets, there's always the free plugin, which comes with a lot of assets. I put some affiliate links down in the description. You can support the channel. All right, so that's how you use AEJuice assets. It doesn't matter if it's an AI video or regular video. That's how you add sazon and flavor into your videos at the very end. I hope this tutorial was useful, was helpful. To the next one. Peace.